Welcome everybody to another joyful session of our Joy of Eating. So today we're going to talk about salt, how much it's safe to use. So, all right, so I'd like to have a little disclaimer as always that the information on this presentation is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. All content, including text, graphics, images, and information is for general information and educational purposes only. Let's start with some curiosities about salt. So the word celery actually comes from the word in Latin for salt, which is sal. So the soldiers in the Roman army were sometimes paid with salt instead of money. Did you guys know about that already? The salt was used as payment, that's why they made the connection salt for the word salary.
Yeah,
so that may be something that you guys heard before. So that's where the word salary comes from. But also the word salad is the Latin word for salted greens. Also because of the ancient Romans had a habit of dipping the romaine lettuce in salt. And that's where the word salad came from. So I thought that was interesting. And a little quiz, and we don't have a poll for that, so you can just unmute yourself or type in the chat. More than 40% of the dry salt produced in the United States is used for this one function or this one end. So you can unmute yourself if you want to guess, or if you want to put in the chat. What do you think more than 40% of the dry salt produced in this country is used for?
Cheese?
Cheese? No, good guess though. A lot of people eat a lot of cheese.
horses.
Milk?
Milk? No.
Oh,
It's actually used for highway de-icing. More of the salt, 40%, so the biggest chunk of the salt production is for highway de-icing, not for food. But that's not what we're gonna investigate today. Our presentation is the use of salt in food, but I just thought it was interesting, those facts. So, okay, before I show the answers, what are some of the ways or some of the functions of salt in foods besides the common enhancing flavor? What do you think are some about the functions when we use salt in cooking?
To preserve.
Yes, so it's used as a preservative. Let me see if that's the next option. Yeah, preservation. So salt creates a hostile environment for certain microorganisms because it dehydrates the bacterial cells. So it inhibits bacterial growth in subsequent food spoilage. Yeah, so salt is used for preservation. What else? Besides flavor enhancer, preservation.
fermentation.
Fermentation is one of them, is down my list here.
In the chat, Donna said to make a brine to preserve food. So preservation.
Right. Yes, yeah, in fermentation. Also, it helps with the texture. So I think more food scientists would be, informed about that. But even to make the bread dough, salt has an important function. It helps to hold more water and carbon dioxide. So it helps the dough to, to ferment, and it helps with to form the crust outside the bread. With meats, it improves tenderness, and with cheese, it aids in the consistency of the cheese. So it's used also for texture. Also, it can be used as a binder, part of the function, especially when it's used in processed meats. It helps to retain water, and it helps the protein in meats in the presence of salt to form a gel. So it helps to hold the product together, especially because processed meats is a combination of different types of meats that are ground together. It's also a color developer. So when they add salt in high concentrations to processed meats, it's also to help retain a more desirable color. Otherwise, those pieces of meat would start looking more like a gray or muddy color. So it has the function of being a color developer as well. And like somebody mentioned, fermentation, so it helps to control the processing of fermentation. So for making, for pickling, for cheese, sauerkraut, salmon sausage production, So salt has an important property in those situations. What are some of the types of salt you guys heard about?
Sea salt, pink
Mhm.
Himalayan sea salt.
Yeah, pink salt, sea salt,
Himalayan.
yeah, Himalayan,
The gray salt.
gray salt,
Epsom salt.
Epsom salt, which is more like as a natural remedy, right? That's a good one. So I'm gonna list a few here, but the list can go on and on. Kosher salt, I was investigating that a lot of chefs like to use kosher salt because it doesn't have iodine, so they say that it doesn't have the bitter flavor that can come from iodine, although I don't taste any bitter flavor in iodized salt, but I was reading that that's a preference for chefs. We have Himalayan pink salt. We have black salt. Have you guys tried to use black salt before?
Yes,
Does it look black?
it is black.
Yeah. Actually, when I buy the black salt at the Indian store, it looks pink. So, but I'm sure they have another type.
No, my
Um,
black salt is well from the
It looks what color,
Pink.
Veronica?
pale pink. I have it
Yes.
right
Yeah,
behind that.
yeah, it's pale pink, black
Yes.
salt.
Yes.
I buy the
Black
black salt at
sulfur.
the health food store, really black.
Mm,
Mhm.
okay. And that's used for cooking too, Sonia?
Yep,
Okay. Yeah, so this black salt that I buy at the Indian store, I use it when I want my tofu to kind of have that more egg flavor because it even has the sulfur smell to it. Smoked salt, I never tried any smoked salt. Have you guys tried smoked salts? Flavored salts. So I was looking at Amazon and they had this world gourmet sea salt samplers that comes from different parts of the world. So it looks very pretty with all the different colors and they have different flavors. So I guess it can be, for those that like more gourmet cooking. Have you guys tried any of these flavored salts? No? Okay. And then the traditional table salt, that's the one I think most of us tend to use. It can be fortified with iodine, which is important for thyroid regulation. We talked about that last month. If you missed the discussion, you can always go back and watch the recording. Angie, if you can keep an eye on the chat to see if there are any questions, let me know. Salt substitute. Have you guys heard of salt substitute? Yeah, made out of potassium. So table salt is sodium chloride, is not 100% sodium, it's about 40% sodium, 60% chloride, but it is the highest concentration of sodium we tend to consume. And then we have salt substitute. Instead of using sodium chloride, they use potassium chloride. So it's sodium free. It helps to give a salty flavor, but some people say when you cook with it, it gives more of a better taste. I've tried, I thought it was okay, but I didn't keep consistently buying. Have you guys tried it before? The potassium-based salt?
Yes, I've tried that and I just as soon go without it.
So you use it all the time?
No, I don't use it. I tried it a couple times when I was being super serious. I would rather use the lemon juice rather than this salt substitute.
Okay, so you didn't like the flavor much. Okay. All right, so we also have salt-free seasonings, which don't have the sodium chloride or the potassium chloride. So this is, those seasonings that are more combinations of herbs and spices. Here in the US, Mrs. Dash is a very popular brand. Have you guys tried Mrs. Dash before? How many of you have tried? I know some of you don't have your
Oh,
camera.
yes.
Yes, many
Yeah.
times.
Yeah, I've tried it. I'm just not consistent with using it because I tend to use my own herbs and spices. So, but I've tried it and I think it does help to enhance the flavor because I had to do some cooking demos for a group that they wanted the recipes to be completely salt-free. So I had to use those, Mrs. Dash to enhance the flavor. Other brands would be Trader Joe's. And as you can see, the ingredients is just a combination of different herbs and spices, but be aware that some of them may have black pepper. So if it's something you don't use, you should be reading the labels to verify. Costco also carries a no salt seasoning. So, most stores now have their own brands for the salt-free seasoning that you guys could experiment with. So let's talk about some of the implications of consuming too much salt and health. So first of all, we need to establish that sodium is an essential nutrient. We do need some. It's in charge of regulating the extracellular volume. So it helps to regulate the fluids in our body. It helps with the acid-base balance. It helps with nerve impulse transmission and muscle contraction. So those are the main functions. So we need sodium, not too much, but we're gonna find out by the end of today's discussion how much it's safe and if sodium is the only concern when it comes to the health issues that have been linked to sodium intake. So sodium is naturally occurring in both plants and animal foods, and is more concentrated in the form of salt, which I mentioned is sodium chloride. So it's estimated that 90% of the sodium we consume is in the form of salt. So how much sodium, which is the essential part of the discussion today that we need. So sodium we need based on our age group listed here. So I'm assuming everybody here are adults older than 13. So we need to meet our needs about 1,500 milligrams a day, and we have a suggested limit of 2,300 milligrams a day. So we're gonna break it down how much that means in terms of salt. So table salt, 1 teaspoon has about 2,360 milligrams. So roughly speaking, the limit of salt we should consume for the day of sodium should be about a teaspoon of salt. But we need to consider the sodium we get from processed foods. So that's part of the equation as well. Other concentrated sources of sodium used in food preparation, especially as a preservative, would be sodium alginate, sodium nitrite, sodium nitrate, sodium benzoate, sodium sulfate. So these are more typically found in processed meat. So if you grab a label of a traditional beef hot dog and you read the ingredients, most likely you're gonna find some of those preservatives listed. We also have monosodium glutamate, also known as MSG. So it's a flavor enhancer. Baking soda, it's a type of sodium as well. It's a sodium bicarbonate, and baking powder also has baking soda in it as one of its main ingredients. So those two are concentrated sources of sodium used in baked goods. So let's look at some of the health conditions that have been associated with excess salt intake. Can you guys name a few that you have heard? Some health
High blood pressure.
Yeah, high blood pressure, I think is the one people are more familiar with. Have you heard of anything else? All right, so let's start with high blood pressure, hypertension. So that's the definition when your blood pressure is 130/80 or higher, regularly. So long term, if you have your blood pressure 130/80 or higher, that's the definition for hypertension. And some people are more prone to have higher blood pressure in the presence of high salt intake. So they call those people salt sensitive. And according to research, the group that are more sensitive would be older adults, African Americans, and individuals who have metabolic syndrome, diabetes, or chronic kidney disease. Have you guys heard of metabolic syndrome before?
I haven't.
No. So metabolic syndrome is pretty much another name for prediabetes. So those are individuals that have a cluster of health conditions that are predisposing them for chronic diseases. So typically they have, higher blood sugars, high triglycerides, high blood pressure, central obesity. So they call this metabolic syndrome because it increases the risk for several chronic diseases. Now, one important thing to point out is that this group is more salt sensitive, but also this is made worse when the diet is high in sodium and low in potassium. So that's something we're going to start to develop throughout this presentation too, that high sodium doesn't seem to come alone. It seems to come in, in the context of a diet that is also low in potassium, especially if people are, consuming the sodium mostly from processed foods. So that's one thing to consider. But excess salt intake has also been linked to cardiovascular disease, mainly because of the increased risk of hypertension, but also high salt can also, damage the lining of the arteries and stiffen the arteries. So that's another mechanism too. Chronic kidney disease, so salt can directly affect the kidney, and they call it that the scientists point that there is a dose response. So the higher the salt intake, the higher the damage that you can cause in your kidney over time. Kidney stones and osteoporosis, I put those two together because it's the same mechanism that leads to the increase of kidney stones and osteoporosis in the presence of a high salt diet, because the high salt will cause the body to excrete more calcium, because as the salt is concentrated in the blood, the body is trying to increase the calcium to balance out the salt, and the calcium is then, the excess calcium is excreted in the urine, which, passing through the kidneys increase the risk for kidney stones. But also once that calcium is excreted, the body needs to replenish it. So it's, it takes out of the bones to replenish the calcium that was taken from the blood. So this cycle can create an increased risk for kidney stones and osteoporosis. Some scientists and some researchers also identifying that a high salt intake can also be one of the links that precipitate autoimmune disease in susceptible individuals. So individuals that have a genetic predisposition to certain autoimmune disease, such as type 1 diabetes, multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, Crohn's disease, they can have even higher risk now in the presence of a high salt diet. And the mechanism is that the high salt environment seems to trigger a mutation in one of the immune cells that it turns them more into inflammatory cells rather than a regulatory cell. And then we have stomach cancer. So they also see a link with the high salt intake. The salt can directly damage the lining of the stomach, and those stomach cells can mutate and turn into cancer cell over time in the presence of a high salt diet intake. In this study here that was published last year by the Journal of American College of Cardiology, they list all of these conditions I talked about, and they put in this chart here just to illustrate, the different mechanisms of a high salt intake, through raising the blood pressure, damaging blood vessels. It can also affect some hormonal pathways, some inflammatory pathways, immune response. It can affect our gut microbiome. It can damage the gastric mucosa, increase urinary calcium excretion. It can even, they also see that it can alter some of the fat metabolism and increase fat deposition, which in turn leads to a high risk of obesity. And in the presence of a high salt diet, people tend to drink more fluids, but unfortunately, part of the fluids people tend to drink is from soft drinks, which is another link to obesity. So because of all those conditions that lead to those chronic diseases or an increased risk for those chronic diseases, they see that the global burden of this disease is estimated to cause 70 million disability adjusted life years. So that's a calculation, for people that, they become, they're not working as long as they would because of disability related injuries. And it causes about 3 million deaths a year. So that's what the scientists estimate is linked to a high salt intake. So it's very important to identify salt or sodium, the sodium content in labels, because at home, if you were to cook everything at home, we know that we'd pretty much be safe by using about a tablespoon for the whole day. But if we buy foods that are pre-packaged, we need to be informed on how much would be too much. So the easiest way is to look at the daily value column here in percentage. Anything that is 5% or less is considered a low source of whatever nutrient is referring to. So in the case of sodium, when you see the sodium roll here, you would look for that 5% or less. And this is based on the US, guidelines. I don't know for other countries how they do that. Anything with 20% or more is considered high, and anything between, the 5 and 19 is considered moderate. So that's how you can quickly identify the foods you consider buying, if they are low in sodium, high in sodium, or moderate in sodium. So keep in mind the limit for the day is suggested to be 2,300 milligrams. Some of the language that you may see listed on the front of some products may say sodium free. So to qualify to be sodium free, the food needs to have 5 milligrams of sodium or less. Those that are very low sodium, 35 milligrams or less, and low sodium, 140 milligrams or less. Also, if the product says light in sodium, it means 50% less sodium than the regular version. So it doesn't mean necessarily that it's going to be low enough. It's just 50% less than the original. And reduced sodium is when it's 25% less sodium than the regular version. So that's what those, the verbiage that they use. All right, so I have another question. See if you guys are going to guess the right answer. What do you think is the #1 food that contributes to the daily intake of sodium in the US? What do you think people are getting most of the sodium from? What type of food?
In the chat, Melinda says chips.
Fast foods.
Chips is a good guess. Fast food is a very good guess because it's actually in the fast food area, because sandwiches account for 21% of the sodium intake of populations ages 1 and older.
Bread.
Yeah, so bread is part of it, right? The fast food, the sandwiches, which are made with the bread. Also, the cheese, which is pretty high in sodium, and most of the sandwiches people consume in the US are going to have some type of processed meats, right? So that are right. So the processed meats in general, it's a big contributor, but based on this survey that they conduct in the US, you can see here that 21% is coming from sandwiches, most likely consumed from fast food, like somebody said. So how can we enhance the flavor of foods besides using salt? I mentioned the salt-free seasonings, but can you think of something else? And I have a hint here on the screen. So what are some of
Yes,
the
and I mentioned it before. This is TJ, and I use lemon juice.
Yeah, so lemon, the citric acid in lemon or lime gives a salty flavor, right? So we can definitely take advantage of that. What else? What else can we do?
Other spices, and they don't already have to be pre-mixed, but just find some you like that will make do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so using more spices, lemon or lime. What else? What else do you guys find that when you're cooking helps to enhance the flavors?
Herbs.
Herbs, yes, which can be fresh or dry herbs, both will work, right?
Yeah.
Anything else?
It's not good, but people flavor their foods with liquid aminos, whether it's coconut or the regular Bragg's, and also soy sauce.
Okay, so I'm glad you brought that up because actually I have something to say about that. So let's see what I came up with here on my list. So fresh garlic and fresh onions, which most, I'm from Brazil. We use garlic and onions in pretty much any savory dish. So they give a lot of flavor, but also using garlic powder and onion powder enhances the flavor even more. Fresh herbs, dry herbs, all the spices, soy sauce and miso. There are actually some studies coming up that are showing that a moderate amount of soy sauce and miso to replace salt actually has a more neutral impact on blood pressure. So it doesn't seem to raise the blood pressure as much or even at all compared to salt. So it has a more neutral impact. And they think it's because of some of the properties in soy, but also because of soy is a high potassium food. And potassium is something that we're going to develop this topic a little bit more, seems to neutralize the impact of sodium. So soy sauce and miso are actually not as bad as once thought because of new studies coming. So you can use some of them to enhance flavor in your cooking.
Yes, can I say something?
Yes.
I think that there are people who do have problems with sodium, low sodium. And so low sodium can be detrimental as well.
Right. Yeah,
So
we're going to
they
talk
have
about
to
that.
watch those things too. So no added salts. There are a lot of people who drink adequate amount of water, even more water, and that can flush some of the salts out of their system. So we have to kind of balance it, because if we tell these people not to take salt in and they do have a problem, then, it can affect their heart as well and put them into what we call arrhythmias. So we have to kind of balance that. If they have a problem and they don't know and they decided not to eat salt, then that can be a problem if their sodium and their chloride would go down too low.
Yes, I'm
because
glad you
I've seen
mentioned
these
that.
patients already that they ended up in the hospital with arrhythmias and can be deadly.
Right. Yeah, I'm gonna talk about some conditions. I'm glad you pointed that out. Yes. Yeah. So we need to find the balance, because there are certain conditions that should absolutely, not follow a low sodium diet. We're gonna talk about that. So thank you for bringing that up. Mushroom has that umami flavor that helps to give, enhance the flavor in dishes. So we can take advantage of using that too. I actually have a seasoning that I use that is mushroom based. I think I showed you guys a couple presentations in the past. One of the dishes that I made that is a mushroom seasoning. Nutritional yeast is also another, flavor enhancer that usually those who, are moving towards a more plant-based diet tend to use this commonly. And roasted nuts. So instead of using salted nuts, just roasting them seems to enhance the flavor. And so if you do that, you can cut back on the need of, adding too much salt. Let's talk about some of the extremes. So we don't want to do too much. We can do some. We're going to talk about finding the right balance, but let's look at some of the problems with dining out. So this group called the Center for Science in the Public Interest, they put out every year some of what they call the dining out nutritional nightmares. Some of the dishes that they say that are designed to add a notch to your belt and a blow to your heart. So let's say, we could look at those dishes I'm going to show, in several different ways, but let's focus today more on the sodium content, since this is the topic of today's presentation. So keeping in mind the total intake of sodium for the day is suggested to be 2,300 milligrams or less. Let's look at some of these dishes here. So the Cheesecake Factory breakfast burrito has 4,630 milligrams. Has anybody tried that? I have a confession time I have. So I ordered this a couple times in the past, a few years ago. And I used to ask them to remove the bacon, the chicken, and the chorizo. And I ordered with the rest. And this stuff is huge. It's probably the size of my head times 2 in terms of how big it is. Yeah, so I've confessed it and repented, but I have tried this in the past. So look at the amount of sodium. It's worth pretty much 2 days worth of sodium. I wouldn't be able to eat this at one sitting, but I have tried. And believe it or not, I didn't feel it was that salty. So probably mine wasn't as salty because I asked them to remove the bacon, the chicken, and the chorizo. So maybe that cut, maybe half the sodium right there. And then we have this AMC 1.5 pounds of soft Bavarian style pretzel that has 7,600 milligrams of sodium. So that's worth almost 3.5 days worth of sodium. I mean, this is a huge thing. Most likely people would order this and, share with the family members. It's served with nacho cheese and mustard. I've never seen this in person. Has anybody seen it?
PJ says you can order it without the salt.
Okay, so that probably cuts a little bit, but I'm sure it's in the dough and also in the sauces. Yeah, so it's 1.5 pounds of pretzel.
Do you know, Maggie, if that sodium count is including the cheese and mustard, or?
Most likely, yeah. Most likely, yeah. Then we have the Zuna Pizzeria Penny with aged cheddar, Parmesan, and Romano topped with buffalo chicken, and that's 4,530 milligrams of sodium. So it's just to show you that eating out, it's much more of a problem than what we cook at home, because we don't tend to use that much salt, or also granted they're using some of the processed meats or cheese that some of us may not use at all at home. So how many of you find that when you go out to eat, foods taste a lot saltier than at home? That's true, isn't it? I actually one time went out to eat and I had to send the food back because I could not taste anything but salt. I was like, something may have happened. Maybe the chef is not having a good day, but I'm sorry, I cannot eat this. So they had to make me something else because it just tasted like pure salt. Has this happened to you guys? Like the food that came to your table was extremely salty?
I've had that happen at a restaurant where previously their food was very good, but the last time we went, it was so salty. And it was the last time we went.
Oh, yeah. That explains why it was the last time. Yeah. So, I mean, there are things we could probably do and ask them to cook our foods, with less, but then you're afraid they're not going to season with anything. So it's hard to find the balance, but, trying to limit eating out is important as well. So just to bring the point that somebody, raised as a concern, is consuming too little sodium also detrimental to our health? It seems like it. So there was a meta-analysis study that was published in 2014, and they analyzed the data involving 274,683 patients and participants, and they concluded that both low sodium as well as high sodium intakes are associated with increased mortality. The low sodium was classified as those consuming less than 2,645 milligrams of sodium per day, so equivalent to a little over a teaspoon of salt. And the high sodium was those consuming almost 5,000 milligrams per day, equivalent to a little over 2 teaspoons of salt. Another large study that was published around the same time looked at the sodium and potassium intake from over 101,000 individuals from 17 countries they had the same conclusion that an intake between 3,000 and 6,000 was associated with a lower risk of death and cardiovascular events compared to intake outside this range. So this amount of sodium is equivalent to 1.25 and 2.5 teaspoons of salt per day. The other findings that point to a more moderate intake of salt versus a drastic reduction being associated with reduced mortality also for individuals with type 2 diabetes and congestive heart failure. And last but not least, there are some conditions that should absolutely stay away from low salt diet. In other words, they need extra salt. Individuals who had their colon removed and they have an ileostomy. Actually, my mother-in-law, has her colon was removed due to colon cancer many years ago. So she actually needs to eat a high salt diet because she's losing extra salt and fluids because the colon tends to retain or reabsorb water and salt, but because the colon is removed, now she loses, the extra fluid and salt. Also, individuals who sweat profusely, which could be athletes that regularly training. If somebody is on the hot weather without AC, if you on a sauna, regularly, or patients with cystic fibrosis, and anything that leads to sweating profusely. In the sweat, you lose salt. Therefore, you need to replenish that salt. So a low salt diet is not recommended for those conditions. Also, if you have episodes of vomiting and diarrhea, part of the fluid you need to replenish needs to contain some salt to help retain the fluids in the body more efficiently. So that's why we need to find the balance, with the message not to eat too much salt, but also not to do too little, and pay special attention on those conditions as well. We should not forget potassium, though, as I touched briefly before. So potassium, more and more studies are coming out pointing to potassium as a balancing mineral when it comes to sodium and the detriment effects on our health. So there is evidence that salt sensitivity can be reversed with sufficient amounts of potassium in the diet. The problem is the recommendation is about 4,700 milligrams a day, and only 2%, less than 2% of US adults are currently meeting this recommendation. So that's why we see a lot of these problems. It's, some health experts are pointing is not just the sodium, is the sodium and potassium balance. So people are eating too much salt, yes, but too little potassium. Once this ratio is improved, cutting back on the salt a little bit, not necessarily too much, but also increasing potassium intake. So we're gonna take a look at some of the foods that are high in potassium, but can you guys name a few that you already know are high in potassium?
Celery.
Celery? No, celery can be a good source of sodium and naturally occurring. It didn't come up on my search as being too high in potassium, perhaps because of the serving size, but can you think of other foods that are high in potassium?
Bananas.
Yes, bananas, I think, is one.
Doesn't potatoes have potassium?
Oh, sorry. Celery is high in sodium.
Correct, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so potatoes, definitely. Anything else? Raisins, yes.
Kale.
Raisins. Kale, yes. Green leafy vegetables, for sure.
Beans.
You guys are very good. You listen.
Squash.
Squash, yeah, winter squash. So let's look at the list. I put together here some plant-based foods. Obviously, I didn't have, I could have listed a lot more, but it gives you a pretty good idea on what foods you can get a lot of the potassium from. So Russo potato, from the potatoes I was looking up, that's the one that came up with the highest concentration. So one medium Russo potato is almost 1,000 milligrams, so 952. Avocado, 690 milligrams. Pomegranate, which is in season now, one medium pomegranate, 666. And it's not the mark of the beast, by the way, even though it's 666. And you can see here, beet greens, green leafy vegetables in general. Pistachios of the nuts is the one that concentrates the most potassium, coconut water. The reason I found that out, I was looking at my refrigerator. My husband likes coconut water. I was like, let me look at the label. I was like, it is high in potassium too. So I put it in the list. Edamame is high in potassium, but when you dry roast it, it concentrates a little bit more because now you remove the water. Banana, a large banana is almost 500 milligrams. Brussels sprouts, also almost 500 as well. Golden potatoes, one medium golden potato, 419. Mushrooms in general are gonna be high, but I looked up portobello mushrooms, so about 1 cup is 313. Pulses, which includes dry beans, lentils, peas, chickpeas, half a cup cooked, 300 to 350 milligrams. So if you eat a whole cup, obviously you double your potassium. Grape tomatoes, 1 cup, 395 milligrams. And then you can also, consider any tomato-based foods like tomato sauce, ketchup are gonna be high in potassium too. Soy milk. So I was looking on the US food database and they listed 1 cup as 379 milligrams. But this morning I was looking at the soy milk I have from Trader Joe's and it's almost 500 milligrams per cup. So potassium concentrate a lot in plant-based foods. So animal foods, the exception will be milk, but milk is even less than soy milk. So cow's milk is a little bit less potassium than soy milk. So those who follow a plant-based diet are going to have an advantage because we tend to consume more of these foods, but it's important to, educate ourselves that they are, we should be mindful to consume those high potassium foods on a daily basis. Not all of them on the list, but, select from those sources. So does the Bible say anything about using salt in foods? We know the famous "you are the salt of the earth" verse, but let's look at what the Bible has to say about using salt in foods. And as I was doing my research for this topic, I found, yes, the Bible is one of the historical references on the use of salt to give flavor to foods in general. But I found out, and that was new to me, or actually I hadn't paid attention before, I guess, that they were even instructed to add salt to the meat offerings. So because the high priests had to eat part of the meat offerings, they were instructed to season them with salt. So you can find some of the Bible verses too. And even Job, poor Job, as he was going through his trial, on chapter 6 of the book after his name, he started, as he's lamenting his condition, part of what he's talking about, he throws this discussion here on salt, and I found it interesting. So he says here, can flavorless food be eaten without salt? Or is there any taste in the white of an egg? And then he concludes, my soul refuses to touch them. They are as loathsome food to me. So I guess we can find out based on this that Job didn't like egg whites, right? So he didn't like the taste of the white of an egg, but also he's mentioning that salt has an important component of giving flavor. I don't know of the spiritual theological applications of what he's, saying here, but, we can see that, it was traditionally viewed that salt was used to give flavor and to make food taste good.
Can I say something, if you
Yes.
don't mind? Okay.
Yeah.
Athletic people who exercise a lot and they sweat. They can sweat out the salt as well. And that's why sometimes they may have cramps in their legs because their electrolytes may be down.
Mm-hmm.
So in those people, it's hard for them to really reduce their sodium intake because they exercise every day and they're sweating a lot. And so
yes, absolutely. That's what we talked about when we said the groups that should not be on a low sodium. Yes, people that sweat a lot, they need to replenish the salt they're losing in the sweat, definitely. And then Jesus mentions, he brings up the application that we are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, so again, he brings the common application that people use, a salt to flavor, into the spiritual application. And how it shall be seasoned. If it loses flavor, it's good, then good for nothing, but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. That's in Matthew 5:13. The Mark 9:49 Jesus also says the salt is good, but if salt loses flavor, how will you season? Have salt in yourselves and have peace with one another. So because salt was so commonly used and it was a value, a high value commodity, so that's why he draws these applications, that we should be perceived as people that brings flavor as we interact with others, that we should be perceived as that peculiar people that God intended it for us to be. So those are beautiful applications, but the main point is that we see those also can be used as historical documents that salt was used to flavor foods in Bible times. In terms of a health message, we have a pretty balanced message. So a couple quotes from the writings of Ellen White. The first quote is found on the book Counsels for the Church, page 237, paragraph 3. It says, some of our people, while conscientiously abstaining from eating improper foods, neglect to supply themselves with the elements necessary for the sustenance of the body. Those who take an extreme view of health reform are in danger of preparing tasteless dishes, making them so insipid that they are not satisfying. Food should be prepared in such a way that will be appetizing as well as nourishing. It should not be robbed of that which the system needs. And then she says, I use some salt and always have, because salt, instead of being deleterious, is actually essential for the blood. So we have, the scientific evidence that we need some. We have biblical evidence, and we have, the spirit of prophecy writings as well. And then the balancing quotation, she says, do not eat largely of salt. So we need to eat some, but not too much. Give up spiced pickles, keep fiery food out of the stomach, eat fruit with the meals, and the irritation that calls for so much drink will cease to exist. And then she's talking in the context of those people who drink a lot of water or other drinks with the mealtime. And then she adds, but if anything is needed to quench thirst, pure water is what nature requires. Never take tea, coffee, beer, wine, or any spirituous liquor. And that's found in the book Christian Temperance and Bible Hygiene, page 51, paragraph 3. So the take-home message, a high salt diet is more harmful if the potassium intake is insufficient, and is also more of a concern for people that already have chronic disease going on. So we can use salt, not too much, mostly from homemade cooked foods, while enhancing the flavor with herbs, spices, lemon, and some soy-containing seasonings to replace some of the salt. Reading the labels will help us to identify foods that are very high in sodium. We should limit eating out and be selective when we go out to eat. And last but not least, plan on eating high potassium foods on a daily basis, unless you are on a medically necessary low potassium diet, which is the case for some individuals. So this high potassium diet, which, just the adequate potassium we're talking about, is easier to achieve as we center our diets on foods from plant sources. So that's the take-home message. I hope it was enlightening for you to understand the proper balance. Do you guys have any questions before we show the final slides?
I did have one statement and something that I've used at the store, so I don't have to do the math, whether it's 5% or 10%.
Mm-hmm.
For example, if you're on a 2,300 calorie diet, your sodium should not exceed 2,300. So if something per serving, so if something's like 160 calories per serving and your sodium is 160 or less, that's kind of a guideline that I've gone through, because when I'm at the store, I'm not thinking in percents.
Okay, so you're trying to match the calories to the sodium. Okay. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Someone said that it's better to use Himalayan salt, the black salt, instead of the sea salt / table salt, because it's purer and it's better for high blood pressure. What do you say about that?
Yeah, so in terms of the studies for high blood pressure, when they're looking at salt, they don't separate table salt from Himalayan salt. They put them all together in the studies. So it would have to be something, the individual would have to try and see if there's a, difference with themselves, but the studies, they don't separate.
Okay.
Mhm.
I have a question, Maggie.
Yes.
Is there one salt that is superior to all the others?
In terms of what? Nutrients, micronutrients?
Health, nutrients?
Yeah, so the sea salt, tends to retain more of the minerals because, table salt has been more refined. And I buy one now that is a sea salt with iodine because the soil has been depleted with iodine. So I use a sea salt with iodine. That's the one I use at home. And I also use some soy sauce, some miso, herbs and spices. So those are the ones I tend to go to.
And Maggie, is it true that a lot of these different types of salts, they may be different in mineral content, but when we're talking about hypertension or anything, we're really looking at the sodium content.
Right.
So it's not just the salt, but it's the sodium content of that.
Yeah, so the sodium seems to be pretty similar across the board. Some people claim that some of the more coarse salts, you end up using less than the more fine salt because, they are going to occupy less space in, let's say if you're measuring a teaspoon, the coarser salts, you're gonna end up consuming less of the sodium because they don't fill the spoon as much as the fine grains. But yeah, the sodium content is really what we're talking about, and it's the same across the board. But also something we need to focus is to make sure we are eating, high potassium foods. And I think that's something, if any of you are healthcare professionals, that, a message to those with high blood pressure has been just, lower your sodium, but very few people are telling them, are you eating enough potassium, right? So you need to have this balanced approach, is a more holistic approach, looking at the entire diet, not just one element. So in terms of the resource, this is a very good lecture that Dr. George Guthrie did on Audioverse. If you go to audioverse.org, you can type on the search box to salt or not to salt, and then click, the play. Don't just listen to it. Look at the presentation because he shows his slides and he explained this balance of sodium and potassium really well. So I think it can enhance what we discussed today if you have some time. I think it's about 45 minutes, his presentation. So I think you would find helpful.